The Ganymede hypothesis starts with the question of the axial tilts of the various planets in our system, which are known at this point. If you were to assume that a solar system were to arise in any kind of a manner that you read about in your school textbook, you would assume that the spin axes of the planets and the sun would be roughly perpendicular to the plane of the system, right? That's not what we find exactly. The sun, Mercury, and Jupiter do look sort of like that. They all have axis tilts under 10 degrees. You have to figure that the sun, Jupiter, and Mercury were an original system. You've got two planets with oddball axis tilts, each having its own separate little story. You've got Venus, which is basically upside down. You could say the axis tilt was roughly 180 degrees. It spins backwards, right? It spins, in the opposite direction of the other bodies in the system. You've got Uranus, which is laid over in an 80-degree angle. And then you've got these other four main bodies in our system, which all have this rough 26-degree axis tilt, which is an anomaly. Okay, you've got Neptune, Saturn, Mars, and Earth. And the axis tilts are shown from a Wikipedia page that range from about 24 to about 27 or 28. And you have to assume from that these four bodies were captured as a group by the sun. Right? That makes for a very strange kind of a story. You would wonder about being captured as a group, how that would create axis tilts which were roughly the same for four separate cosmic bodies. What you have to understand is that this original system that you had, which included Neptune, Saturn, Mars, and Earth, was not an orbiting system the way that our present solar system is. It was an electromagnetically aligned system, what you would call a Herbig Haro string, which is something which you see in telescopes named after two astronomers, Herbig and Haro, and these things are created by Birkeland currents which arc through very large regions of space due to the plasma nature of most of the, something like 99.9% of the mass of our universe really is in plasma form, right? You get charge separation in these plasmas, and because of the charge separation, you get electrical currents arcing through space, and these take the form of twisted pairs of currents, which are called Birkeland currents, and they look sort of like DNA, RNA spirals. At the points at which these currents cross each other, you have electrical short circuiting, which you call pinch points, or Z-pinch or Z-pinch points. And these Z-pinch points do have the power to agglomerate plasma into protostars and stars. Now, there's no way that gravity can form up planets or stars or anything like that. Just out of plasma and dust. Gravity is by 40 orders of magnitude the weakest force in nature. This would be a Herbig Haro string. You can see the spiraling of the two currents. Okay, on a very much larger scale, you have strings of galaxies, right? You have electrical currents, these same kinds of Birkeland currents, on a vastly larger scale, creating strings of galaxies like every one of these points of lights where and you can see the spiraling of the currents, right? But every one of these points of light that you see where the currents cross is not just a star, it's an entire galaxy. You have what they call our local supercluster, which is called Laniakea, right, which shows in such a way that every point of light in this picture is an entire galaxy, right? You've got the Milky Way galaxy at one little corner of the thing, which you can see with the red dot here. And the whole thing basically is an electrical arc discharge of some sort. So in other words, basic reality is that electrical and electromagnetic forces rule the cosmos. We do not live in a gravity-controlled cosmos, right? The day of the gravity-only cosmology is over. And so you have to ask yourself, what do we have sitting back there in our own neighborhood like 30, 40, 50, 60, 100,000 years ago? Right, well, the answer is that you have a double system. You have like a very bright northern system, which is the sun and Jupiter's moons and Mercury. And the normal thing within our galaxy is for gas giant planets like Jupiter and Saturn to orbit main sequence stars considerably closer than Jupiter and Saturn orbit our sun now. Okay, you would have to assume that with these other bodies missing at the time, right, with Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth, and anything else included in that group not having yet been captured, that all you've got in this northern system is going to be the sun and Jupiter and Mercury, and you would expect Jupiter to be essentially within the habitable zone of the sun under those conditions. Now the other side of this thing says that you have like a dwarf star, which is what Saturn would have been under those conditions. And you've got the bodies which are aligned with Saturn, particularly Mars and Earth, inside the plasma heliosphere of this dwarf star. Now they call these things brown dwarfs, but that's sort of a misnomer. These things are purplish, right? What you have in the way of radiation coming from a dwarf star like that is going to be a deep purple kind of a cosmos in which the middle part of the light spectrum is simply not there, it's missing. Okay, and that's what you see in this picture. You've got a plasma sheath, or heliosphere of the dwarf star, and you've got light or radiant energy bouncing off of this plasma heliosphere back onto these planets from every which direction, so that you've got a situation where you're not going to freeze to death or anything like that. It's like, there are ice ages, right? But that's a separate story. But under normal conditions, in a situation like this, you've got sufficient radiant energy. But like I say, you're going to have to do a good job of seeing in very dim light, right? You're going to be living in a deep purple kind of a world, which is called the purple dawn, like in the oldest oral traditions of indigenous peoples of the world, people that actually remember these conditions. The literatures describe this. You've got luxuriant vegetation, which would be reddish. It's not going to be the kind of vegetation which thrives in our present world under the light of a main sequence star. You've got a completely different kind of a world with completely different kinds of animals and animal sizes. Okay. There's a question of how Saturn and the bodies aligned with it would have ended up being captured by our present sun, right? There's a difference between the Holden-McLachlan version of this thing and some of the previous versions of Saturn theories which have been floated in the past, particularly coming from the Thunderbolts group. Most of these have Saturn wandering in from deep space somewhere, possibly from one of our satellite galaxies, which would take an immense span of time, right? Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is that the real history of our planet isn't long enough for that to happen in a reasonable manner. It's like, how old is the Earth, right? I'm going to go off on a sort of a tangent here. It's like, they used to try to claim that the Earth was 5, 6, 7,000 years old based on the chronologies that you would get from the Bible. And that doesn't really work. We've got the one planet in our system which really is ballpark for some kind of a, 5,000 or 10,000 year age estimate, which is Venus. But Venus looks like that, right? This was the whole point of Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision. You've got like a surface temperature of, which would melt lead, 850 degrees more or less. You've got a massive thermal imbalance, radiates a great deal more energy than it takes in from the sun. You've got like a massive infrared, upwards infrared flux. You've got a complete lack of regolith, right? There's no dirt on Venus. It's like every part of that is what you would expect from a new planet. Okay, the Earth and Mars don't look like that at all, so you have to assume the Earth and Mars are much older than that, but there's no way to believe that they're hundreds of millions of billions of years old. Part of the problem is that the people that are telling you that the Earth is, that our system is 4 billion years old are the same people that tell you that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. We know that isn't correct. It's like, they're finding soft tissue and dinosaur remains these days, and they're getting good radiocarbon dates from the soft tissue, and those radiocarbon dates are coming in between 20 and 40,000 years. Even one cosmic catastrophe in the history of a planet like ours completely wrecks all the assumptions which the dating schemes that you're familiar with are based on. Okay, all you can really do is guess, try to come up with a reasonable, educated guess as to how old our system is. And what I would do to construct such a guess would be to take that 40,000 year figure, which would be the outside figure that you get for radiocarbon dates for dinosaur remains, and plug that into your normal little 24-hour clock model, which says that if the whole history of the Earth is 24 hours, then dinosaurs appeared at 10:45 p.m. If you do that, you get an age of about 700,000 years, which to me seems reasonable. If you multiply that by 5 or 10, just to give the evolutionites every possible chance, then you're still only talking about 5 or 10 million years at the outside, right? Which doesn't leave any sort of room for evolution. And it doesn't leave any sort of room for the idea of, our system capturing a dwarf star like Saturn used to be from somewhere off in far space, right? In other words, if you were to assume that something like Saturn were to try to get captured by our own system, starting from even as close as Alpha Centauri, then you would be talking about, the amount of time it would take for that to happen would be longer than what I just described as a reasonable guess as to the history of the Earth, right? In other words, that just doesn't figure logically. What Troy, McLachlan, and I are assuming was the case was that the Saturnian system was part of an original system, which included the sun and the northern system, which included, in other words, everything that we see around us anywhere close to us, was basically formed in an initial Herbig-Haro string, right? The string broke off at some point. You ended up with the string breaking, and you ended up like with a northern and a southern system. And then ultimately the southern system spiraled back into the region of the sun system and was captured. That's the difference between, Troy's and my version of solar system history and what you would get from some of the other versions of the Saturn theory, which have been promulgated. Now, you've got the question of purple and gold being royal colors in literature. Lord Byron, what did he have to say about it? So the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue waves roll nightly on deep Galilee. Okay, textbooks tell us that purple and gold were royal colors in ancient times because dyes for those colors were too expensive for normal people. That's pretty lame. In real life, those two colors were the primary colors of the sky in the 2 ages which preceded our age. New information from the realm of philology tells us that words for the color blue were either totally missing in many ancient languages or were the last color words to turn up. What exactly is philology? That's the study of ancient literature and culture, right? That's what Nietzsche used to do for a living. That's what I would call Julian Jaynes, right? Would be a philologist. No, that has to be a hobby. You can't, you won't find any jobs for philologists in the want ads or anything like that. Got the stories that you can read about the birth of the blues here. None of that should surprise anybody familiar with Troy McLachlan's work. Seeing blue in a deep purple world would be difficult, if not impossible. What kind of animals would you expect to be living in a deep purple world like this? Well, the most obvious thing is that you can have animals with huge eyes, and we still have some of these around: lemurs, bush babies, tarsiers, owls, owl monkeys. And the other thing which had huge eyes like that, which is really a trip, is the Neanderthal and the other hominids all had these same kinds of huge eyes, and the dinosaurs actually all had the same kinds of huge eyes as well. There have been recent articles about dinosaurs all having been nocturnal, presumably, because of the sizes of their eye sockets. Now, for the most part, you had reasonable reconstructions of Neanderthals in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then, for a period of decades, continuing in the present, the Neanderthal has generally been presented as a kind of a poster child for Kumbaya religion. Like we're all really just alike, right? The pictures that you see, the reconstructions that you see of Neanderthals, for the most part, look like humans, just a little bit different, right? Like, just supposed to be slight racial difference. That turns out not to be the case. The most major thing that you notice about the Neanderthal, or if you had one standing in front of you, would be the eyes. Fabulously bug-eyed creature. They had always assumed that the Neanderthal was a primitive human because of the size of his brain, right? But when you combine what we know about these eyes with the idea that the Neanderthal brain was dominated by the part of the brain involved with vision, then you begin to understand that the Neanderthal brain was basically the neurological equivalent of the circuitry for a military night vision system. That's what you're looking at. This is sort of a scary creature. We'll say a little bit more about him shortly. But these are the creatures of the dark world now, the Purple Dawn world, originally before humans came to our Earth. You get some of the people at the Thunderbolts group claiming, and they're correct, right, that the most obvious place to look for living worlds would be around dwarf stars, right? I mean, that this would be, these would be like watery environments which would have temperatures which would be conducive to life as we know it. And there'd be every reason to believe that you would find inhabited places in the neighborhood of dwarf stars, but you might not really be interested in going to those kinds of places based on who you would expect to see in those places, because I think this is the guy that you would expect to meet, on planets which are located around dwarf stars. I think this would be pretty normal. That's sort of a dead end. I mean, I don't think there'd be a whole lot in the way of business relations or anything like that you could establish with him. Danny Vendramini notes that the Neanderthal skull is a very good match for an ape's profile, a very bad match for a human profile. Okay, all of this comes from Danny Vendramini's website and book, which is called themanus.org. I have one of Troy McLachlan's drawings here. The southern system, the system which consisted of Saturn, Mars, and Earth, didn't just fly straight into the sun's system, the northern system, in a straight line. It spiraled in. And on this spiral, before final capture, there was at least one point of near capture. Okay, after which the southern system would spiral back out into deep space. The idea of the Ganymede Hypothesis is that on one of these near, somewhere around probably 40, 50, 60,000 years ago, however long ago it was, you would have had a very close contact, and the two bodies in each of the respective systems, which would have been on the outside of those systems and which would have come closest to each other, would have been Ganymede, like in the northern system, and then Earth, which is the largest rocky, each of which are the largest rocky bodies within their respective systems at the time. Okay, these are the two bodies which would have come closest together, the Earth and Ganymede. When you get two electrically charged watery bodies coming close to each other like that, you get a phenomenon which is called a water bridge. Well, let's take a look at that. Okay, I mean, that's not hard to find on YouTube. I'm going to switch here, and we're going to go back, and we're going to start this. That's the basic idea of the water bridge. Now, humans and dolphins have the smallest relative eye sizes of advanced creatures. There isn't any way to believe that humans could have arisen under conditions which would be just completely, which would render humans nearly dysfunctional, under which the human visual system would be all but useless. And, you have to assume that if you had an original system, which was a double system, with one very bright system and one, bright watery system, the other system very dark, that humans would have arisen on the bright side of the thing. The whole question of a water bridge gives you some idea of how the humans would have ultimately gotten to the Earth, right? I mean, you would have had people splashing around in the water on a place like Ganymede, just enjoying themselves. And like out of the blue, I mean, you would have had this gigantic vortex opening up in the sky above them. They would have just been sucked through. Now, it's not to say that all of them would have made it or survived. Some of them apparently did, right? This is the genesis of humans on our own planet. There is no generally accepted word for the people who lived prior to the time frame of the Bible. Troy McLachlan and I use the term Cro-Magnon as a kind of a catch-all. In other words, we're using, for everybody that lived prior to those times. In other words, we're using the term Cro-Magnon where scholars, a couple of hundred years ago would have used the term pre-Adamite. Okay, terms which you see in academia these days, which would include AMH, EMH, anatomically modern humans, early modern humans, are problematical in the sense that they're trying to combine actual early humans with what you would call school COFSA, or gracile hominids, right? And that is highly problematical. And so, again, we're using this term Cro-Magnon as a catch-all for the first real humans that you had walking around on the planet. And the question is, what do we know about Cro-Magnon man? What all can we say with any certainty about these first humans that you had on this planet? For starters, the most major thing which we don't know about Cro-Magnon or pre-Adamite man is exactly how many such separate groups of them arrived on Earth via separate events. Troy McLachlan and I use the term Cro-Magnon to mean all humans living prior to Adam and Eve as a means of simplifying the discussion. Again, there could have been more than one such group. There's a question as to how many times advanced cultures might have risen and then fallen again in the huge space of time since the earliest such Cro-Magnon groups. One thing scholars all agree on is that whatever caused Cro-Magnon people to appear on this planet when they did was not gradual. Danny Vendramini, writing in Them and Us, notes, the speed of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution in the Levant was also breathtaking. Anthropologists Ofer Bar Yosef and Bernard van der Meersch write, between 40,000 and 45,000 years ago, the material culture of Western Eurasia changed more than it had during the previous million years. This effervescence of technological and artistic creativity signifies the emergence of the first culture that observers today would recognize as distinctly human, marked as it was by unceasing invention and variety. During that brief period of 5,000 or so years, the stone toolkit, unchanged in its essential form for ages, suddenly began to differentiate wildly from century to century and from region to region. Why it happened and why it happened when it did constitute two of the greatest outstanding problems in paleoanthropology. Likewise, Eduardo Cardona, writing in Flare Star, where and how the Cro-Magnons first arose remains unknown. Their appearance, however, coincided with the most bitter phase of the Ice Age. There is, however, no doubt that they were more advanced, more sophisticated than the Neanderthals with whom they shared the land, living in larger and more organized groups than the earlier humans. This is Eduardo's writing. I wouldn't agree with this. I wouldn't agree that the Neanderthals or any of the other hominids were humans. Cro-Magnon people spread out until they populated most of the world. Their tools, made of bone, stone, and even wood, were carved into harpoons, awls, and fish hooks. They were presumably able hunters, although, as with the Neanderthals, they would have foraged to gather edible plants, roots, and other wild vegetables. The only problem here is that, as far as can be told, the Cro-Magnon seem to have arrived on the scene without leaving a single trace of their evolutionary ancestors. Neanderthal arrived, this is Eduardo Cardona quoting Ian Tattersall. When the first Cro-Magnons arrived in Europe some 40,000 years ago, they evidently brought with them more or less the entire panoply of behaviors that distinguish modern humans from every other species which has ever existed. There's also a question of artwork, that is, going from hominids with no artistic capabilities whatsoever to the Cro-Magnon Sistine Chapel at Lascaux, with no evidence to be found in the world of any sort of a run-up to that. That obviously is not compatible with the idea of humans evolving from apes and or hominids. What that is compatible with is the idea that Cro-Magnon man, fully formed, came here from somewhere else in our system, which is the basic thesis of cosmos and collision and the Ganymede Hypothesis. So we ask ourselves, what do we know about the first humans, Cro-Magnon humans, who came to this planet some 30, 40, 50, 60,000 years ago, whatever it was? Okay, these dating schemes are not completely reliable, but we know that he came here suddenly, that there were no traces of any kind of an evolutionary run-up or anything like that to Cro-Magnon man. We know that he was not related to hominids like the Neanderthal. He was not descended from them. He never interbred with them. He's related to hominids only via similar morphology, similar design, right? That's about it. We know that these first humans came here from, an overwhelming likelihood, came here from another place within our own solar system, which would be Ganymede, Jupiter's largest moon, which would have been a water world, a freshwater ocean world of sorts, with floating bergs and anchored islands of pumice. And we know a couple of other things. You would expect that these first humans would have been adapted to an aquatic life. They would have been essentially aquatic mammals, and that turns out to be the case. Now, you've probably heard of Elaine Morgan and her Aquatic Ape Theory. There are two ways you could look at that. You could look at the Aquatic Ape Theory as another form of evolution, or another version of a theory of evolution, in which case it really doesn't make any sense. Or you could look at it as a theory of human adaptation, in which case it's the best theory which has ever come down the road, but it's never gotten any traction in academia, particularly in the United States. And the two reasons for that is there's no physical evidence of any kind of an aquatic ape ever having lived on the planet. There's no fossil remains of an aquatic ape that have ever turned up. And then the bigger reason, which says that there's never been a body of water on this planet which would be safe for humans to live in on a full-time basis. You only need to spend 10 or 15 minutes in the ancient sea monster section of the Smithsonian Museum to comprehend why humans would not have been living in water 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago on this planet. In other words, Elaine Morgan's theory is perfectly good. It simply requires a different kind of a world to happen on. She lists 100 or so human traits which we share with the aquatic mammals and which you don't find amongst land animals. The most interesting, I think, is this question of voluntary control over breathing, right, which we take for granted. Monkeys and apes don't have that, and that's the only reason that you can't teach chimpanzees or gorillas to speak English. They can learn deaf signs perfectly well, and at least one of the gorillas which has learned deaf signs has taken human IQ tests on a couple of occasions and achieved scores from about 70 to about 75 or so to 90. And, that's adequate for half the jobs in the world. I mean, you could put somebody like that to work. That might be the solution to saving the African gorillas, really. Nothing which works for a living ever goes extinct. At any rate, so that you know that these early humans were basically aquatic mammals. And the other thing that you know about these earliest humans was that they are genetically more or less the same as the people of Genesis and the people of more recent history, but that the original cultures and technologies were completely and totally different because of this gigantic span of time between the two saltations. Right? There's no way to believe that Cro-Magnon man was ancestral to the people of Genesis. There's no continuum there. It's like if there was any kind of a continuum between Cro-Magnon man and the people of Genesis, there would be a list of things which Jewish literature would have to know about. The knowledge simply isn't there. And there's several entire categories of things, like a Stone Age. There was never any kind of a Stone Age in Genesis, right? I mean, Genesis 4, Tubal-Cain, the people of Genesis were metal technology people from day one. You don't read about stone tools or anything like that. Weapons, the atlatl, the boomerang, right? The atlatl was the signature weapon of all Cro-Magnon people, and in fact, Aztecs were using them against the Spaniards, and you have people in Australia using atlatls to hunt kangaroos even today, right? The Jewish literature and the literatures of the Western nations the thought never crossed their minds. You never heard of it, right? It's like the weapons of the Bible are the sword, the sling, the spear, and the bow, right? The word javelin appears like 3 or 4 times in the Bible. That's about it, right? So that you've got this complete and total lack of any kind of a technological or cultural bridge between the two groups. There is one gigantic thing which, if there'd been any kind of continuum, you would expect that Cro-Magnon man and his descendants would have to have known about, okay, which would be the wheel, right? I mean, this completely flummoxed I guess, there's never really, from what I can gather, there's never been a case of a Cro-Magnon descended group which had wheels for transportation. They had pottery wheels, right? But the idea of a chariot or a cart or wagon or anything like that just doesn't seem to have ever occurred to anybody. This flummoxed the Spaniards. Like they were sitting and looking at pyramids and gigantic cities and wondering how in the world anybody could achieve a level of civilization like that without having wheels. And there's one suggestion I could make which says that if your ancestors had just spent the last 20 or 30 or 40,000 years living in water, the idea of a wheel might not ever occur to you. I mean, that's just, excuse me, this is just one of those funny things. You've got the question of humans not having fur, right? There's another kind of a story involved in that one. It's like, that I believe would be an adaptation for using fire on open and windy areas, right? That says that the first humans were, in other words, like an incident which would cause a minor burn to a human could easily light a Neanderthal up like a torch and fry him. Okay, Neanderthals had fire, but they had to be a whole lot more careful of it with it than early humans did. That says that these first humans were, on their home world, were probably coming up onto land and cooking things. That they were eating a mixed diet of fruit and shellfish and later on fish, right, when they learned how to kill fish with atlatls. And, they were coming up and cooking on land fish and shellfish and anything resembling protein that they ate, and they were taking fruits down from trees and, eating fruits which grew naturally. They didn't have to farm fruits or anything like that. I don't see how vegetables, particularly green vegetables, ever would have been a part of that original diet. The atlatl appears to have originally been a fishing weapon, which they were probably using pronged points, rather than just an ordinary type of a spear point or arrowhead type point. And you can find pictures and scenes on the internet of native Australians and native people of the South Sea Islands using atlatls to fish with. And when those people got to this planet and discover that they had to be able to kill land animals for meat, and they also had to be able to deal with hominids, like the Neanderthal, which they didn't want to try to take on at close quarters if they could help it. Then, they probably took the fishing points off of the atlatl spears and added ordinary hunting or killing points. But it wasn't much of a change or much of an engineering change or anything like that. The neat thing about Cro-Magnon hunting weapons is that you don't have to guess as to how they work. They're still being used. You can find some of these on the internet. Let's take a look.
Trafiggere un canguro scagliando una lancia col propulsore è già un'impresa straordinaria, ma abbattere un pipistrello gigante con il boomerang rasenta l'impossibile. La volpe volante, quasi 1 metro d'apertura alare, ha una centrale ultrasonica nelle orecchie che le permette di evitare con l'incalcolabile velocità di 8 millesimi di secondo un oggetto che cerchi di colpirla. Eppure, contro un simile bersaglio, gli aborigeni di Cape Melville, nel Queensland, sanno adoperare un'arma dalla traiettoria imprevedibile come il boomerang. La caccia ai pipistrelli giganti è assai vantaggiosa. I proiettili non vanno sprecati e la selvaggina è di un sapore delicato, con carni bianche più dolci di quelle di un coniglio.
The question of humans and hominids. What kind of relationship do you have between humans on the one hand and hominids, Neanderthals and other hominids, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and whatever? The authors of Cosmos and Collision and the Ganymede Hypothesis do not buy the idea of any kind of an evolutionary relationship between humans and hominids. We believe humans and hominids are related only via similar design, right? I mean, that's really all you're looking at. The idea of humans evolving from hominids is not tenable. For any hominid to have evolved into a human, that hominid would have to have lost his fur while ice ages were going on, lost almost all of his night vision while living in the perpetual twilight of the Purple Dawn Age, and while surrounded by predators which could see very nicely in the dark, lost almost all of his sense of smell while trying to survive as a land prey animal. That's obviously not a formula for success in life. I mean, you add all three of that to get those things together, and that just doesn't work. That third item would have been more or less instantly fatal for a land prey animal. Again, aquatic mammals do not require a keen sense of smell. The one other shot anybody might take at a hominid to human evolutionary claim would be to claim, as Danny Vendramini does, that Cro-Magnon man arose from gracile, that is, School-Kafsa hominids. Vendramini claims that predation by Neanderthals drove those gracile hominids into a fast process of evolution into Cro-Magnon man, that is, the Gould-Eldridge type of evolution, which they call punctuated equilibria, right? Nonetheless, looking at James Shreve's Neanderthal Peace article, like from 1996, we note, and he's writing about these same School-Kafsa hominids, here in the Levant, However, the arrival of anatomically modern, this AMH, anatomically modern humans was marked by no fancy new tools, not to mention no painted caves, beaded necklaces, or other evidence of exploding Cro-Magnon culture. In this part of the world, how modern a human looked and its body said nothing about how modernly, it's kind of like Donald Trump's use of language bigly, how modernly it behaved. You can't expect anybody to believe that Cro-Magnon man with his grand art and advanced tools and weapons arose in very little time from something like that, particularly when you have a vastly better explanation to hand as per the Ganymede Hypothesis. The school calls the hominids are basically just other hominids, which have developed a bit more in the way of morphological similarity to modern humans than usual. What do we know about hominids? The term hominid pertains to several related families of creatures which were native to our planet as opposed to humans. Humans very definitely cannot be viewed as another family of hominids. Skulls of Erectus, Neanderthal, and the Skulkopsa hominid. You can see that you're looking at things which aren't human. Sometimes when you get reconstructions of Neanderthal entire skeletons, right? It's like they appear to have the Neanderthal looking down at his feet so as to appear not to have a snout, so as to appear not to be prognathic is the word that they use, but it means that they want him to, or they would like to have the reader believe that they're seeing a creature with a flat face like humans, not with a snout like a dog or a cat would have, even if it was, somewhat slighter, more slight than you would expect, less pronounced than with a normal type of an animal like a dog or a cat. Evolutionists generally believe in a line of descent running through monkeys, apes, hominids, and then modern humans, but that general paradigm is in disarray at present. The best known and most recent hominid, and the one you'd normally assume was the last non-human ancestor of modern man, is the Neanderthal, but studies show Neanderthal DNA to be about halfway between ours and that of chimpanzee, which eliminates the Neanderthal as a plausible human ancestor. The most common claim that you hear now is that humans and the Neanderthal are cousins, with some common ancestor usually taken to be Homo heidelbergensis several 100,000 years back. That, of course, is nonsensical. Too genetically remote to be ancestral to, that is, in double quotes, right, double quote, too genetically remote to be ancestral to, double quote, is a transitive relationship. That is, it's like claiming that wolves are too genetically remote from foxes to be ancestral to them, and therefore foxes must be descended directly from fish. In other words, you've got people with PhD degrees in anthropology or paleontology who need some kind, or appear to need some kind of a refresher course in basic logic. If that isn't bad enough, the popular image of the Neanderthal, that is, the image which scientists proclaim and which the media carries, has been corrupted by pseudo-religious and pseudo-ideological ideas over the past several decades, until we have a situation in which the conception which scientists and scholars had of the Neanderthal in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is more accurate than the image which scholars have today. Late 19th century scholars had a pretty good idea of what they were seeing in Neanderthal remains. For instance, Pierre Boule's depiction of the Neanderthal. Or Ignatius Donnelly's description in Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. Ignatius Donnelly was a kind of a Renaissance man who actually served as a governor of Minnesota, like in the second half of the 1800s. And he had written a book which was similar to Immanuel Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision. He had put together some of the story, in other words, working mostly from Nordic mythology and oral traditions and legends. He had put together the story of an encounter between the Earth and some kind of a large cosmic body, which he assumes is a great comet, right? Now, that's what this book of his was about, largely. But he talks about the Neanderthal remains, which were just becoming known at that time. Ignatius Donnelly, in another cave in the Neanderthal, that is the Neander Valley, near Hochdale, between Düsseldorf and Elberfeld, a skull was found which is the most ape-like of all known human crania. The male to whom it belonged must have been a barbarian brute of the rudest possible sort. The horrible and beast-like proportions of the Neanderthal skull speak with no less certainty of undeveloped, brutal, savage man, only a little above the gorilla in capacity, a prowler, a robber, a murderer, a cave dweller, a cannibal, a Cain, as in, Cain and Abel. It's a safe bet that Donnelly would not have allowed his daughter to marry such a person. Again, however, in more recent decades, the Neanderthal has become a sort of a poster child for what some call kumbaya religion, and popular images show a person just a little different from one of us. But are any of those more recent images believable? The following is what we actually know about the Neanderthal. Neanderthal DNA was roughly halfway between ours and that of a chimpanzee. That eliminates any possibility of humans being descended from Neanderthals via any process resembling evolution. The Neanderthal skull was a very good match for an ape's profile and a bad match for a human profile. We've gone over that above. There are no Neanderthal needles. Cro-Magnon needles are common, right? Early human needles are common. Nobody's ever found the first Neanderthal needle. A creature with a 6-inch long Ice Age fur coat simply doesn't require needles or anything else related to clothing. Neanderthal footprints are more ape-like than human-like. They actually find these are not reconstructions or anything. They have footprints in Neanderthal caves. Rib cages are conical, as are those of the primates, to make room for the gigantic upper body musculature, the kind of musculature you need to haul a 200 or 400 pound body up into a tree. Our rib cages are cylindrical. They have a completely different basic design. Eye sockets and nasal areas very much larger than ours. Placement of nose and eyes on faces much different, much higher than for humans. We know that the mindset of the Neanderthal was similar to that of an African lion. That is, he viewed the living world as neatly divided into two categories, his own family group and meat. Even though the Neanderthal families were on the menu and they find the remains of Neanderthal groups with clear butchering marks made by flint knives, in other words, the Neanderthal was cannibalistic. We know from Rob Gargett and his studies that if you put the skulls of a human, a Neanderthal, and a lion together, the two which have much of anything in common, the Neanderthal and the lion, we know that Neanderthal population dynamics were similar to those of other predators, apex predators, and that there were never more than somewhere between 10, 12, 15,000 Neanderthals alive on the planet at any one time. We know that the Neanderthal could adapt to an omnivorous diet when it was available, but in the setting of the European Ice Age, he was for all intents and purposes a pure carnivore. We know that Neanderthals were not giants. It was sort of the Eskimos of the hominid world. A tall Neanderthal might go 5'10" or 6 feet, but a male Neanderthal could very easily have stood 5'9" and weighed 300 pounds with no extra weight on him. Okay, this is a much more heavily built creature than all but the strongest humans. We've got this image from Rob Gargett, the subversive archaeologist. Danny Vendramini's Neanderthal reconstructions. None of the images noted above, nor any which you're likely to see in most media depictions, match up with any of the realities that we've just gone over, but there is a New Zealand scholar by the name of Danny Vendramini who has produced Neanderthal reproductions which match all of what we actually know about the Neanderthal remains. And his works may be seen in a book titled Them and Us, a website of the same name, www.themanus.org, and a YouTube video titled Neanderthal Profile of a Super Predator, and that's easy to find. These are the kinds of images that you see, and some of these images have the fur removed just for purpose of discussion, but, this was a creature with a 6-inch long Ice Age fur coat. And you've got something, again, with DNA, which is halfway between ours and that of a chimpanzee. You have to ask yourself, what would you expect them to look like? And the thing which jumps out at you are the eyes, right? These are purple dawn eyes. These are not the eyes that you need for a creature which lives in daylight and night, like a modern day diurnal creature, right? Something which could operate both at night and in daylight. I mean, it's not going to have eyes like that. This is a creature which never saw anything like that we would call daylight. These are the creatures of the purple dawn. The fur has been removed again on some of these images for illustration, but you get the idea. So much for the claim of humans evolving from hominids. In fact, as per the thesis of Cosmos and Collision, humans with the relatively tiny, bright world adapted eyes and hominids with their very much larger dark world, purple dawn eyes, did not even come from the same world. The humans were native to Earth, or hominids rather, were native to Earth, and humans arose in the bright northern part of the original double system. So not only not descended one from the other, there's no evolutionary connection between humans and hominids. They don't even come from the same world. Interbreeding, there is also a claim that because some humans have a certain small number of genes in common with Neanderthals, that humans and Neanderthals must have interbred. And that's just overwhelmingly problematical for a number of reasons. Okay, I mean, for starters, you've got basic logic, which says that amounts to thinking that a Neanderthal male could or would rape a woman and, rather than cooking and eating her afterwards as usual, somehow or other keep her alive long enough to bear a cross-species child, raise that child to reproductive age, and have the child breed back into human populations without anybody catching on. That is, the claim is ridiculous. In real life, what would happen in real life? Neanderthal females would kill that woman the first time her new owner left her alone for 5 minutes. The woman wouldn't fare any better than the subjects of the communist attempts to breed humans and apes into super workers in the 1930s. That didn't work out very well for anybody. Humans would notice the child was different, and I don't mean just a little bit different. It is going to be really, you can see from the picture, right? The child would be, he would be seriously different. The humans would kill that child, and everybody else like him as part of the same program, which killed out the Neanderthal, in other words. Excuse me, they were, at the time, conducting a complete planetary genocide war, right? So you wouldn't need DNA tests to determine who to kill for that sort of reason. It would be exceedingly obvious. And again, there's no way they were going to tolerate, cross-species, half-breeds in the midst while they were, conducting an outright genocide war. The first experience humans ever had with Neanderthals, probably watching friends and relatives being killed and eaten by them. Okay, so they had a very bad attitude towards Neanderthals from very early on. After their arrival here. The Neanderthal died out in a wave going from east to west as he encountered Cro-Magnon humans, with the last Neanderthal stand in Europe being in southern Spain. There's just no way the humans who were conducting, again, such a total genocide war would have tolerated half-breeds in their own midst. That is, even assuming that such crossbreeding was possible. What about the common genes, you ask, right? There's supposed to be like a certain number of genes in common between not all humans, some humans, and Neanderthals. The claim Svante Pääbo of the Max Planck Institute makes is that humans of Asian and European descent share a few genes with the Neanderthal, but that people of African descent do not. Now, there's an obvious problem that says that if that were the case, then Africans would be hugely different from the others, and the basic genetic variation of humans would be huge rather than microscopic as it actually is. Very, very little genetic variation amongst modern humans. Some people say less in the whole human race than in a typical group of 40 or 50 African monkeys of the same species. right? We're kind of like cheetahs in that regard. They say if you've seen one cheetah, you've seen all of them, or at least genetically. I've also noted in this regard there's a far more believable way in which a few hominid genes might have crossed over, that is, a few genes which don't really do anything, might have ended up in modern humans. That doesn't have anything to do with interbreeding. They say you are what you eat, right? This would be Cro-Magnon war parties eating dead Neanderthals after some sort of a pitched battle. Neanderthals would have tried to make a practice out of eating humans, right? I mean, this would be turnabout as fair play. I mean, if you wanted to make an impression on somebody who'd been eating your guys, then, maybe that's what you do. It only sounds stupid until you read up on it a bit, right? Henry G. in The Guardian is talking about bacterial insertion of genes, right? He's talking about, what you find in modern humans. He said the chilling part is that reverse transcriptase is a key feature of retroviruses such as HIV-1, the human immunodeficiency virus. Much of the genome itself, at least half of its bulk, may have consisted of DNA that started out perhaps millions of years ago as independent viruses or virus-like entities. To make matters worse, hundreds of genes containing instructions for at least 223 proteins seem to have been imported directly from bacteria. Some are responsible for features of human metabolism otherwise hard to explain away as quirks of evolution, such as our ability to metabolize psychotropic drugs. Thus, monoamine oxidase is involved in metabolizing alcohol. I have this in red letters. If the import of bacterial genes for novel purposes, such as drug resistance, sounds disturbing and familiar, it should. This is precisely the thrust of much research in the genetic modification of organisms in agriculture and biotechnology today. In other words, we're starting to do just this kind of thing. What you need to picture is some Cro-Magnon war party traipsing around the Alps until somewhere around 4 p.m. they fight a pitched battle with a Neanderthal family group who's, what happens, those guys are, standing around after the battle, right? They're cut, they're bleeding, they're dead, tired, and there's 10 or 12 Neanderthals lying around dead, and one of the Cro-Magnons says something like, man, this has been a hell of a day, right? I'm so hungry I could eat just about anything, and I'm way too tired to go off hunting right now. What the hell is there to eat around this place? And you shouldn't need to be Albert Einstein to figure out what those guys are eating that afternoon or evening. And unless those early humans were to cook a Neanderthal very thoroughly, which is highly unlikely under the kinds of conditions which would have been there in question, you'd still be talking about bacterial content and the possibility of bacterial insertion of genes. And again, it would have to be some kind of genes that didn't really do much of anything. Also in the news recently, confirmed, and you can check this out, confirmed DNA from genetically modified crops can be transferred into humans who eat them. They say you are what you eat, right? That would be the explanation. That is, if there actually is anything to these claims of Neanderthal genes being shared with humans. Now, there may not be. McLachlan has a different take on this whole thing, and he writes as follows. And this is the main thing to keep in mind here. It's after about the 7th generation, any modifying gene is usually bred out, especially if it is a one-off case in the first place. In other words, you're not going to get like large numbers of humans wanting to have children with Neanderthals, right? Or even, Neanderthals succeeding at, raping half of all the human women on the planet at any one time. That's not going to happen, right? So for Neanderthal genes to become a passed-on trait, there would have to be a tremendous amount of interbreeding that involve virtually the entire human population. I mean, that's not there. Troy believes that it's more likely that you had, that any kind of Neanderthal genes or human genes found in Neanderthal remains or whatever are just, samples being contaminated. I mean, that people are simply seeing things which aren't really there. So we must always, this is Troy speaking again, we must always remember that human genes do not have some spurious, unidentified genetic component waiting around to be identified as a Neanderthal element. Rather, it was the identification of human genetic material in the Neanderthal samples that led to the supposed match. It could simply be a case of human contaminated samples until another until another sample is fully processed showing the same human material. The case is not settled. It has been highly irresponsible of the scientific and media communities to have jumped onto this supposed match based on effectively only one sample. The debate rages within the scientific community, but the media reports the Neanderthal human mix as if it were a fact. That's just not reasonable. Okay, that's pretty much the case. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, between humans and hominids, I mean, the only relationship there is similar design. It just isn't anything else there. And so we begin to have a reasonable idea of the history and prehistory of our own planet and of our own species. We have a planet which was part of a completely different kind of solar system until very recently, this purple dawn age. We have creatures, which are similar in design to humans, but are not related to humans otherwise. Hominids, the Neanderthal, dominating this purple dawn world until fairly recently. We have two separate groups of humans on the planet, which has nothing to do with race or color, since either group apparently is capable of producing any color or any feature that you'd ever see. With the Cro-Magnon or pre-Adamite humans who came here, a few tens of thousands of years ago, by all reckoning. And then you have the people of Genesis who either were brought here or created here ex nihilo as per the Bible, much more recently, a few thousand years old, not a few tens of thousands. The two groups are genetically the same, more or less. Is certainly close enough for government work. But the original cultures and technologies were completely and totally different due to this giant span of time between the two saltations. You've got much more water on the earth right now than you had before the flood. You've got a likelihood that most of the places inhabited by humans on the earth prior to the flood are beneath the waves. Now you've got megalithic structures and cities turning up beneath the waves off of Cuba, off of Okinawa, right? And they'll find others. It's conceivable that what we call continental shelves would have been the pre-flood ocean boundaries. We've got a funny situation. We don't really know how many groups of these pre-Adamite or Cro-Magnon people there might have been, right? There might have been more than one saltation. Advanced cultures and civilizations could have risen and fallen a number of times before our present ages, which we have any sort of historical record of. We have a funny situation in which science begins to look stranger than science fiction. There's a sort of a natural evolutionary bias to all science fiction. If you believe in evolution, you'd have to believe that any other living world that you ever found out there would be completely and totally different from ours. Would have evolved along completely different lines, right? And that's not what we're finding. What we're actually finding out there is much more like what a religious person would anticipate. You've got remains of a highly, a high technology civilization on Mars, which are turning up in the MSL images. And you've got the Ganymede Hypothesis and a very high likelihood that you had an original human civilization on Jupiter's largest moon, Ganymede, a few tens of thousands or 100,000 years back, right? And under those conditions, Ganymede and Earth would have been separated by enough space that for all intents and purposes, they may as well have been 50 light years apart. And yet you've got the same RNA, DNA information scheme behind the living worlds of both. You've got the same basic plans for large animals. That is a spinal column, 4 limbs, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, a mouth, a tail, right? You've got basically the same kind of living world, it would lead you to think that no matter how far you went out there, you're not going to find this scene from Star Wars, you know, where you have creatures, you know, the cafe where you have creatures whose morphology is limited only by the writer's imaginations. You know, you're not going, it seems to me likely at this point that you're not going to find that. What you're going to find are going to be worlds similar to our own, living worlds similar to our own, similar to, you know, you'll find creatures such as we see around us now, as well as creatures which we might have found on Earth in past ages. And that seems to be the basic picture.